Thank you. I was very relieved when Mark said that introduction should be short because, of course, I'm kind of an outsider to many of these subjects at this conference. But I'm also very relieved because after John's magisterial introductions, I don't have to try to compete with those. I am also relieved because there's less chance of embarrassing myself and the first speaker by talking of how long we've been friends, which is now 30 years, which is scary. But Johannes, I met Johannes when he was writing his PhD on Homer at Cambridge, and I began after he did, and I can't say how much both my work and I myself have benefited from all these years of dialogue, particularly on Herodotus too. Our later interests had converged. He went on from Cambridge to be professor of classics at Durham, and then now he is professor at Princeton, which is nice, he's nearby. He was originally, of course, a scholar of early Greek poetry and still is, but he went on to author and co-author and co-edit numerous volumes and articles spanning literature and literary cultures of ancient Greece and the Near East. I mean, he is sort of the perfect person to have at a conference like this because of his keen interest in the interface and the dialogue between the literary productions of these cultures. I won't go on, but today he's going to take up that subject again with Troy, Achaemenid stories and perspectives, and it's a real pleasure to introduce Johannes.
Thank you very much, Liz, for the kind introduction. Thank you, everyone, for being here. Thank you. A big thank you to the organizers for having me and for bringing us all together for this wonderful event. I've learned so much already, and I look forward to the remaining panel this afternoon. I realized that in a panel on Achaemenid Asia Minor, you may have expected me to talk about some of the Lycian and Carian texts that John mentioned already yesterday and Dominique mentioned again before the break, or perhaps about Xanthus of Lydia, whose work Dionysius of Halicarnassus so admired. If that's what you were expecting, I must apologize for taking you down a different path. My focus today will be on Troy as a test case for what we can know about Achaemenid stories and perspectives in Asia Minor, and as an excuse for thinking a bit more about how local traditions could feature at the level of Achaemenid officialdom, from prominent collaborators to satraps and all the way up to the great king himself. My hope is that some of this will speak to ideas that have already surfaced in our deliberations about the role of cities and city construction in the empire, about sanctuaries as privileged places of memory making and therefore also of literature, however defined, about oral literature, if that's not too much of an oxymoron, and more generally about the various forms of sub-literary or paraliterary activity such as translation, quotation, commentary, chatter, that round out the picture of an Achaemenid literary culture. And I think we've sort of variously come up against the challenge of thinking of literature in a capacious way, taking in these neighboring intersecting concepts. We just talked about myth again. It's another one. I am personally particularly interested in a phenomenon that I shall call tentatively narrative pamphleteering, telling a story to make a political point, but more on that in a moment. You can all hear me all right, also on Zoom? Is that going okay? Right, good, okay. So, Near Eastern empires had a special relationship with cities. The Assyrian royal annals, some of you will know this much better than I do, portray them as prized possessions, but also as challenges to imperial rule. They have a real city fetish. The Achaemenid inscriptions go the other way. They largely ignore cities, but other evidence from the empire, and I think that's a pointed silence probably, but other evidence from the empire confirms that cities very much still mattered. Herodotus and Ctesias both describe an outsized Babylon testing the resolve of successive Persian rulers, and Herodotus develops city conquest into a leitmotif of Persian imperialism, when he talks about the Scythians, for example, who cannot be conquered because they have no cities. And he really says it in so many words. That's the cleverest thing the Scythians have figured out. If you don't dwell in cities, you're good. And then the Athenians, of course, they sort of picked that up and implemented in the story of how they take refuge behind wooden walls, effectively transforming their urban lifestyle into a form of maritime nomadism. Herodotus goes so far as formulating a law of history that is specifically based on cities. This is that famous passage from the famous opening to the histories that we've already looked at. It's hard to get away from Herodotus. Herodotus was a Greek author, of course, and his view of urban spaces was shaped by Greek tradition, particularly in this case, the Odyssey. But as an Achaemenid Greek author, he did, I think, see something important about how the Persian Empire functioned. The silence of the royal inscriptions notwithstanding, that empire too was built around cities. And there's this wonderful passage in an astronomical diary from Babylon. In fact, it's the famous Gaugamela diary, which describes what happens after Darius' defeat. And this is what it says. The king and his troops deserted the camp, and to their cities they returned. This is so wonderfully suggestive text from a non-Greek context that suggests that the empire is in important ways made up, both based on the cities and defaults back into cities when they collapse. Now Herodotus points out that cities grow and decline over time. What he doesn't say is that they may altogether cease to exist. He could have done, because he certainly appreciated that the old Assyrian capital of Nineveh was no longer there under the Achaemenids. It was, however, still a going concern, shaping imperial memory with the stories that attach to it in several languages, and framing the Achaemenid present as, in the words of Paul Cosmin and Ian Moyer, an imperial future past. I say this because I think we tend to underestimate the importance that cities held in Achaemenid storytelling, and because in my paper I want to look at another example of a ruined city in particular, not Nineveh, not from the imperial heartlands this time, but from the western periphery, Troy. Troy too was a ruin in the Achaemenid period, not entirely, but very largely. The site was inhabited, but as Brian Rose points out in his wonderful book, it suffered a steep decline in the 5th century BC. Now, simultaneously, and this is still Rose, we detect an increased recognition at the time that the site was symbolically important. That's not quite as paradoxical as it may seem. As the modern settlement, really, it was no more than that, of Ilium stagnated and declined, the ruins of its ancient predecessor came to the fore, and with them Troy's role in Homeric storytelling. It was as a Homeric ruin, not an impoverished real-life settlement, that Troy emerged in the 5th century as a powerful political reality in the Achaemenid Northwest. It captured the imagination in ways that could justify Persian expansion beyond the Aegean, and once that project had run its course, it helped consolidate a potentially volatile imperial frontier. The ruins at Troy could also be networked into the geographical and historical horizons of the Achaemenid Empire in such a way as to link up the periphery with the imperial center and the Assyrian past with the Achaemenid present. And this is again touching on something that we've talked about at various points in the conference. This idea of an Assyrian imperial horizon that can be shared across the various language communities, cultural communities of the empire. So let me take these points one at a time. World empires need horizons. right? Borders in the modern sense, not so much. They need horizons. The Sargonic formula from sunrise to sunset persisted over thousands of years, not because it was precise, but because it was useful, spurring the imagination and spawning stories. Gilgamesh epic among them, Aditzi Shamshi, is where Gilgamesh goes. And of course, it could always shift according to need. From the upper sea to the lower sea, another of Sargon's imperial slogans, set down two markers that were seemingly more concrete, but it too could accommodate imperial structures of vastly differing scope. Cyrus, at the height of his power, claims to control a world, quote, from the upper sea to the lower sea, that's what he says in the cylinder, that is orders of magnitude larger than that of Sargon Fakkad. And Cyrus's successors used a variant of the old formula to justify expansion beyond the Western Sea, or as their Babylonian scribes would put it, we saw that in Rahim Shagan's paper, the Bitter River. I've written elsewhere about Xerxes' Greek campaign as a way of showing off his transcendental power, and yes, that was all about imperial display, imperial drama at the Hellespont, bridging the sea. And I've also suggested that Homeric storytelling helped. So that was for an imperial pan-imperial audience. But I've also suggested that Homeric storytelling helped make Achaemenid aggression palatable to a more local audience, who appreciated that Xerxes had come to avenge not just previous Persian setbacks at Sardis and Marathon, but also the historic injustice of the Trojan War. So this is the passage that we've looked at already in connection with the Persians' attitude to sanctuaries. And for me, this is important partly because Athena of Ilium is already so prominent here, but partly also because the way that Herodotus portrays this visit is in terms of imperial contact with Greek literary tradition. Arriving at the Scamander, Xerxes ascended to the citadel of Priam, having a desire, this is a very interesting way of putting it, to see it. After he saw it and asked about everything there, he sacrificed 1,000 cattle to Athena of Ilium, and the Magi offered libations to the heroes. Troy was not the starting point of the Persian expedition. That was Sardis, the satrapal seat that had been sacked during the Ionian revolt. Sardis was Achaemenid real estate. Troy was imperial dreamland. Or perhaps we should say, rather, imperial clickbait. It was here that Xerxes staged an encounter with collective Greek memory, Pythomenos, Achaenon, Hecaster, finding out about all these things, which allowed him to claim the geographical and historical horizons that Greek literary tradition afforded him. And yes, there's always the question of how accurate Herodotus is in these stories, but we just had this sort of conversation back and forth in Bredick, and one thing I think that we agreed was that in a sense, in a context like Achaemenid sort of chatter, imperial oral pamphleteering, it almost doesn't really matter because it's there. You put it out there. Yeah. I think that just by way of an invitation to us all to think as capaciously as we can, as flexibly as we can about literature and literary culture. I've said it already. Now, according to Herodotus, Xerxes kept to the Homeric script as he crossed the Hellespont and entered the Greek heartlands. At several stages in his campaign, he addressed an ancient injustice, winning over Athena of Troy first, punishing Protesilaus, and assuaging Thetis on the spot where Peleus had raped her. We've seen that passage too. One can doubt the details of Herodotus' account. Though I do think they make more sense than has often been supposed. In any case, there can be little doubt that Troy and storytelling about the Homeric heroes at Troy was instrumental in imagining Xerxes' campaign. Now, things changed after Salamis. In the imperial heartlands, Achaemenid inscriptions never again mention Greeks from across the sea. And in the northwestern theater, we find a new sense of mutual demarcation. Among the free Greeks, we see the invention of the barbarian and the rise of various forms of exoticizing literature about the Persian Empire. Dominique very helpfully introduced that to us. Among Achaemenid observers, the preferred medium, it appears, for negotiating the new settlement was not new literature, but new commentary, new ways of talking about existing tradition. We see traces of this in the much-discussed chapters 1 to 5 of Herodotus' histories, which are best understood, it seems to me, as an Achaemenid take on Greek epic. Then they say, the Persians say, in the second generation after this, Paris, son of Priam, who had heard this tale, decided to get himself a wife from Hellas by capture. Notice how Paris hears chatter and acts accordingly. He hears and he lives in this world of chatter. So he carried off Helen. And so far it was a matter of mere seizure on both sides. But after this, the Persians say, the Greeks were very much to blame, for they invaded Asia before the Persians attacked Europe. We think, they say, that it is unjust to carry women off, but to be anxious to avenge rape is foolish. Right-minded men take no notice of such things, for plainly the women would never have been carried away had they not wanted it themselves. We of Asia did not deign to notice the seizure of our women, but the Greeks, for the sake of a Lacedaemonian woman, recruited a great armada, came to Asia and destroyed the power of Priam. Ever since then, we have regarded Greeks as our enemies. For the Persians claim Asia for their own, and the foreign peoples that inhabited, actually just the peoples that inhabited Europe, and the Greek people they consider to be separate from them. Such is the Persian account. In their opinion, it was the taking of Troy, which began their enmity with the Greeks. Now, some scholars have argued that Herodotus is simply imagining here how things might conceivably have looked from an Achaemenid perspective, so pure invention. Some have even thought that he's being deliberately facetious. But in fact, recasting established literary tradition in an imperial mold was, I think, commonplace, standard practice in the Achaemenid Empire. And the kind of chatter, again, we see in Herodotus is only one among many examples of an empire-wide culture of what I suggest we call oral and sometimes written pamphleteering. Deutero-Isaiah is a good example of actual rewriting or addition, reframing. A similar case from the Greek world is that of Onomakritos, who was notorious for having interpolated lines into the oracle collection of Musaios. According to Herodotus, Onomakritos also used Musaios to lure Xerxes into attacking Greece, this time suppressing unfavorable passages rather than expanding or interpolating the text. So you see here a sort of master manipulator of established legitimate tradition who rises above the chatter and gets to talk to the king and set policy at the highest level. Now, again, one can wonder, well, did this guy really have audiences with Xerxes? What would that conceivably have looked like? Yes, we can talk about that, but I think we should also talk about, the way that this notion that you could do this kind of thing sort of trickles through the work of Herodotus, for example, or that of other participants in this storytelling culture. Onomakritus then another example of editorial activity broadly conceived. But as for retelling, we can think of any number of stories in Herodotus and Ctesias, especially when they concern events that were widely discussed, such as the sack of major imperial cities, Nineveh, Babylon, Bactra, etc. Troy, I would suggest, was one of these cities, and the Persian pamphleteers of history 1-5 take advantage of that when they explain Persian hostility towards Greece by going back to the sack of Troy. They concede that the empire is militarily weak, it cannot protect itself and its territories from invasion, but in recompense, they insist on the empire's moral and intellectual superiority. A keen regard for justice was crucial for how the historical Darius presented himself to his subjects, just as an emphasis on right-mindedness defines his legacy in the tomb inscription DNB, which was copied verbatim by Xerxes. But there again, you can see how versions get multiply, voices get augmented in a different context and in a different register. Against this backdrop, Herodotus 1-5 can be read as an imperial opinion piece that combines local and pan-Achaemenid discourses in a bid to shift the conversation from military defeat to matters of justice and right-mindedness. The endgame, it would seem, is no longer a world united under Persian rule, but a balanced continental architecture. And this entire construction, grandiose as it is, hinges on Troy, the city on the Western Sea that exists primarily in stories. Now, Herodotus, of course, says, I'm not going to do that. I mean, I can do it. I can do chatter. So that's what he gives us. But then he says, no, but I'm going to rise above that. Yeah, and this is, I think, part of that culture. We shouldn't necessarily, and then of course, he does do a lady that does give us a lot of chatter in practice. So I think this is part of the dialectic of this kind of culture where everyone clicks and talks and blogs. But at the same time, there's a premium on rising above this and cutting through the noise. As well as leveraging Troy's Western connections, Achaemenid or close to Achaemenid-associated thinkers also drew it into the wider ambit of imperial memory making. This process has a geographical dimension, as I have already hinted. The royal road to Sardis begins in Memnonian Susa, as already Herodotus calls it. Ctesias will follow suit, but Ctesias also adds that the road itself was called Memnonian and explains that it was built by the Homeric hero Memnon, presumably when he came to rescue Troy, as described in the pseudo-Homeric epic Aethiopis. Now, Memnon is a superstar, even by Homeric standards. He is the most beautiful, the most amazing, the most brilliant, after Achilles. And Achilles, of course, will kill him, but he is not a nobody in this tradition. That's what I'm trying to impress on you. And that was already clear to people at the time. Incidentally, just by way of a footnote, not every scholar identifies the Memnonian road, Ctesias' Memnonian road, with the royal road to Sardis, the historic, that we see in our sources. But I still don't see how it could not be that. This is where Memnon traveled out west from Troy from Susa to Troy, and that presumably is where he made his road on that occasion. So, what does Ctesias have to say about this character? And this is from the Persica, fragment 1b. They say that when Tutamus was king of Asia, the 20th after Ninias, the son of Semiramis, and when the Assyrians had held power in Asia for over 1,000 years, Notice that the time we take to set the Assyrian horizon. The Hellenes under Agamemnon campaigned against Troy. Priam, who was oppressed by the war and was king of Troy, but subordinate to the Assyrian king, sent ambassadors to request help. Thutmose sent 10,000 Ethiopians and the same number of men from Susa with 200 chariots under the command of Memnon, the son of Tithonus. At that time, Tithonus was the commander of Persis. So he wasn't just any subject of the Assyrian king. He was the ruler of Persia, no less specifically, and was particularly esteemed among those around the king who had been appointed commanders. Memnon was then in his prime and excelled in his bravery and the distinction of his soul. He constructed a palace on the Acropolis of Susa, which survived until the Persian hegemony and was called the Memnonia after him. He also built a highway through the territory that even today is called Memnon. The barbarians say that such material about Memnon was recorded in the royal records, the Basilicae Anagraphae. The deeds of Memnon are imprinted on the imperial landscape, not unlike those of Semiramis elsewhere in Ctesias Persica. These are not just Greek myths, but Achaemenid myths designed to unify a potentially disjointed imperial landscape. It therefore makes sense that long-distance roads play a prominent part in both. While Memnon allegedly built the Memnonian Road, out west, I think, to Sardis, Semiramis built the celebrated Road of Semiramis to Ecbatana, that was earlier in Fragment 1b. It also makes sense that Ctesias presents these traditions as widely shared. To that end, he claims, falsely of course, that Semiramis set up the Behistun inscription to commemorate her deeds, and that he describes it in some detail. But of course, it's not Darius on the Behistun inscription, but Semiramis. And that Memnon's deeds are preserved in royal documents. Now, I think we can assume that no such documents ever existed, but clearly the need was felt that they should exist, that the alternative facts, as it were, of them existed, should be put out there. And that local storytelling, in this case, really did link up with imperial tradition. So, yeah, this image I find suggestive, this idea of the road-building hero who makes connections through time, through space. Let's talk a bit more about time. Beyond cultural geography, there is a historical aspect to what I've argued last. Ancient empires do not simply float in time. As Caroline Wertzegers, among others, has shown, they must be based in collective memory if they are to attain even just moderate levels of stability, as the Achaemenid Empire certainly did. Now, the Persians habitually looked back, to Assyria in their art and their literature. Just one example, Cyrus in the Cyrus Cylinder calls Assurbanipal Sharu Alik Mahriya, my predecessor. He doesn't say that about Nabonidus. Okay, the text is broken, but I don't think he would have said that about Nabonidus. The various subject populations followed their lead. In Deutero-Isaiah, Cyrus comes as the Messiah into a world that is fundamentally shaped by the Assyrian crisis of 701 BC. And in Ctesias Persica, imperial history not only begins, but also reaches its peak with Assyria. This is when the contours of imperial space are drawn, and when we hear affectively rich stories about figures like Semiramis, Sardanapalus, and, yes, Memnon. I'm fascinated by the affective charge of these stories. Romance-like, in the case of Semiramis, and of course, in time we do get Semiramis romances. And Sardanapalus, tragic, in the case of Memnon. Memnon is not just the most beautiful of the heroes, of the Homeric heroes after Achilles, but also one of the most poignant. Aeschylus and Sophocles both composed tragedies about him, though they were, of course, operating outside the Achaemenid sphere of influence. In Ctesias, Memnon becomes a Persian prince who, for all his beauty, body and soul, must die at Troy. I find fascinating the way that heroic tales of Troy frame the experience of defeat on the empire's northwestern frontier as effectively meaningful. The question remains, meaningful to whom? Is there evidence that the fate of Memnon and of Troy was of interest to those who lived under Achaemenid rule? And this comes back to what Dominique was saying earlier on. The evidence is patchy, to put it mildly, but it is not entirely lacking. We know that sometime in the first half of the 4th century BCE, around 360 probably, a bit before, the Persian satrap of Hellespontine Phrygia, Ariobarzanes, had a statue of himself erected outside the temple of Athena Ilias in Ilium, Troy. He evidently made a show of valuing her support. We also know that his successor Artabazes installed the Greek general Memnon, yes, Memnon, who was also his brother-in-law, as ruler of the Troad. So this is just a little bit on this character. Memnon of Rhodes, not of Susa. Memnon supported Artabazes when he revolted from Artaxerxes III, and he later organized the Persian resistance in Alexander's rear, and did so with astonishing efficiency. This Memnon, it has recently been shown, minted coins in the Troad that featured a local deity on one side, so using the city deity of the place where the coin was minted on one side, and the statue of Athena Ilias on the other side. Anurin Ellis Evans has argued that the statue is portrayed in such a way as to evoke specifically the Homeric Palladion, the cult image of Athena of Troy in Homer, which protected the city and which Odysseus had to steal from inside it before the Achaeans could conquer it. Clearly, the fate of Troy and storytelling about it still mattered to Achaemenid audiences in 4th century Asia Minor. Now, that Memnon was called Memnon may have been no more than a happy coincidence. But I suspect it was more than that. The name Memnon was extremely rare at the time. Ernst Badian claims that it only occurred in this one family. I've not had time to check this. I do clearly need to check it. But whatever the case may be, I suspect that both Memnon himself and his Persian bosses must have considered it meaningful. How could they not, given the way that names were read in antiquity? And if that is not totally off the mark, we have here a fairly well-documented example of Homeric roleplay on the Achaemenid side. And certainly another indicator, more generally, that Achaemenid-friendly stories about Troy still circulated in Asia Minor more than a century after Xerxes visited Troy and sacrificed to Athena Ilias. Okay, to wrap up, Troy appears nowhere in the official Achaemenid sources, and how could it when it barely existed as a real-life urban space? Still, it influenced how Achaemenid thinkers and politicians imagined the empire's northwestern frontier. Should that surprise us? What does it mean? Do the two ruined Assyrian cities of Troy and Nineveh play analogous roles in the Achaemenid empire's literary economy? And how do they, as ruins, relate to the imperial constructions with which Seth discussed yesterday? Haven't had a chance to catch up with you since the paper. I was fascinated by what you said there. These are some of the questions that we might pursue further in discussion. Meanwhile, it seems clear that cities acted as powerful magnets for Achaemenid chatter, pamphleteering, clicking, and so on. In the specific case of Troy, new stories issued from a literature that was not specifically Achaemenid in origin, but became Achaemenid through strategic acts of reinterpretation, reenactment, roleplay. What mattered under Xerxes, it seems, was primarily the network of associations that extended westward from the city across the sea to mainland Greece. A few generations later, Ctesias looked east to Memnonian Susa and its Assyrian overlords. Another generation, and we see a new Memnon appear in the Troad, securing the area for his brother-in-law Artabazus and promoting the idea of imperial Troy. For a while, that was no more than local politics in Hellesponta and Phrygia, until Alexander arrived and claimed the ruins and the world for himself. But that's a different story, so thank you.